Good morning, church. I'm Pastor Michael Airgood, pastor at Pine Run and Glassport United Methodist Churches. Glad you're here to worship with us online.
Remember him who once applied with trembling for relief. Lord, I believe, with tears he cried, oh, help my unbelief.
Miss Shirley was an inspiration to everyone. In our small southern town where I went to college, a town with a long and painful history of racism, Shirley's Soul Food Cafe was the one place in town where black and white people interacted together as a community. Many folks didn't cross the railroad tracks for anything except Shirley's Soul Food. Alton Brown from the Food Network stopped by once and asked to film for one of his shows. Shirley told him that she would do it if she was allowed to talk about Jesus. Jesus was Shirley's inspiration. Everyone knew that she was the best cook in the county, but when Shirley decided to open her restaurant, the idea wasn't so popular. People didn't think her restaurant would make it. But Shirley had a fire inside her and knew that this is what she was called to do. So she found a building that was close to the tracks with good parking, and she had a friend paint the sign, and even though he spelled the word soul incorrectly, she thanked him for doing his best because he had. And she had her family cook with her, and they cooked for opening day. But folks didn't show up. The white folks in town hadn't heard about Shirley's amazing food yet, and while some of her friends trickled through, Shirley realized that mountains of food would go to waste. At that moment, a homeless neighbor came to the window and looked in. Shirley had an idea, a revelation of sorts. She went out and asked him to gather up everyone who needed a free meal. She did not want this feast to go to waste. Her opening day ended as a smashing success with every seat filled, as men and women who couldn't afford to pay anything sat together for a feast of the best soul food you can imagine. Shirley's business picked up quickly, but she never forgot her first guests. At 3 p.m. every day when she closes for lunch, the underserved of the community come and eat a feast while Shirley and her staff clean up. God has blessed Shirley richly, and she has blessed the community in return. She bought 2 houses, a men's shelter and a women's shelter for folks who are trying to get clean. She's sent hundreds of neighborhood kids to college with scholarships. But Shirley always talks about people being ready. She doesn't just let anyone into her homes. She waits until folks are ready, until they know that they need help. She knows that until someone understands their own limitations and needs, that it is impossible to help them in any meaningful way. They still come and eat every day. She still feeds them and loves them and tells them the good news of Jesus. But she tells them, when you're ready to get clean, when you've hit the bottom of that barrel of booze, I'm here. And we've got a bed ready for you when you're ready for us. When you're ready. We've been talking about our 5 areas of focus as United Methodists in Western Pennsylvania. We have talked about how these areas of focus help us to be the church of Jesus that we are called to be when we're ready. Here's how our conference shares about being in ministry with the poor. Christ calls us to be in ministry with the poor and marginalized. Our emphasis is on with, standing with those who are regarded as the least of these, listening to them, understanding their needs and aspirations, and working with them to achieve their goals. It also means addressing the causes of poverty and responding in ways that lift up individuals and communities. United Methodists believe working side by side with those striving to improve their situation is more effective long-term than top-down charity. Today we have the story of the wedding banquet. A story where a man invites his friends to a wedding, they don't show up, he invites strangers, and then he complains about the strangers. Dr. Amy Jill Levine, she always asks, why do we assume that every time Jesus tells a parable about a king, that the king is God? People hated their kings. So why do we assume that the king is the embodiment of a righteous God? Christ is the king, but not every king is Christ. Too often we pastors feel compelled to explain the meaning of a parable, but that's not why Jesus told parables. He wanted his followers to wrestle with the meaning of the story, to dig in and think and question and challenge their deeply held beliefs. Our Bibles usually put little titles above each section, but Jesus didn't name this story. You might have noticed that there is no wedding at this wedding banquet. The king invites his friends and no one comes. Have you ever turned down a wedding invitation for no reason? Why? Free food and booze? Who is turning that down? Wedding in Jesus' day were a weeks-long excuse to drink and be merry. Why did everyone refuse to join in? We need to wrestle with that. I grew up very poor, and wealthy people and poor people often live in very different cultures and hold different value systems. Sometimes I feel bad for folks who have always been very wealthy. Wealth brings its own set of challenges, but wealthy folks very rarely know the depth of community that our poor neighbors experience daily. The wealthy have very rarely needed the community's support surrounding them. It's a beautiful and humbling experience to have people give up their wants to take care of your needs. We have much to learn about what it means to be a community from our neighbors who have nothing. They have much to teach us. The story ends with a man being thrown out of the banquet hall, not only into the streets, but outside of the city, because he isn't dressed in a fancy enough wedding robe. He was literally just invited off the street. Is he really the only one without a wedding robe? We've often read this story and take this as a judgment on the poor man. But what if this is a judgment on the king? Why don't people want to come to your wedding? Hey, dude, you're a jerk. The king didn't care about celebrating the wedding, about his child's love, didn't care about the joy of relationship. He wanted to throw the best party. The original bridezilla screaming, "You have ruined my perfect day," casting him out to the outer darkness for not dressing well enough. It is so easy to want to give people solutions when what they need is dignity. When they need someone to listen, we are ready to talk instead. We are ready to give simple answers, to take the way that we have learned about things as gospel truth instead of listening to the gospel's instruction to stand with the poor. We need to go upstream and figure out why people are falling in. It's not enough to just fish them out. The church has struggled throughout history with being in ministry with the poor. Sometimes the church has exploited the poor or spiritualized poverty, promoting the big faith of the poor without calling out the monstrous actions of those keeping them in poverty. The church, from time to time in history, has built bigger palaces for patriarchs on the tithes of people living in poverty. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, was adamant that being in ministry with the poor is at the core of who we are as Methodists. Our church is a church of the poor. And we are not a church of Jesus if we aren't a church of the poor. We are not a church of Jesus if we cannot embrace the poor like he did, fully and openly, inviting them into deeper relationship, not trying to fix them so they can be good enough for us, but learning to love one another in beloved community. We will know that we are a church of the poor when we understand that we are only as rich as our poorest neighbor, when we understand the needs of our neighbor are our needs too. Then we will have heard the words of Jesus correctly. May it be so. Amen. So friends, go forth in the name and the joy of Jesus, knowing that God continues to call us to go and tell the others the good news, to go and make disciples of all nations. Go in peace. Amen.